The question in my mind is, how do you create or relaunch a highly profitable and successful 6 to 7 figure business? With so much conflicting advice about the best ways to start and grow your business, how do you get it right the first time? I want to help entrepreneurs make a real difference and navigate the messy world of startup or relaunch. My name is John North, and this is the Startup Secrets for Entrepreneur Show. Join me today when we dig deep with our guests and get you the best blueprint so you can fast track your own business. This episode is sponsored by Evolvepreneur.app, your all-in-one online business system. Make sure you subscribe for future episodes at startupsecrets.show right now. So let's get into today's episode.
Now, if you've ever wondered why your business or why your life isn't where it really ideally needs to be or where you want it to be, then you've got to listen to the Evolvepreneur Secrets Show, where John interviews myself.
Okay, we're ready. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, ever ready. Okay. You're listening to the Evolvepreneur Secrets Show for entrepreneurs, and I'm your host, John North. And today I've got a very special guest, Rik Schnabel. Hopefully I've got his name right. Who's an actual international best-selling author of 5 books, radio host, a Brain Untrainer. We'll talk about that later, and how to alter his clients' neural patterns to stop their issues from stopping them. So welcome to the show, Rik.
Thank you very much, John. Awesome. Great to be here.
Cool. So we're going to dig into some interesting things. We talked about a few ideas before we started the episode. Can you give me a little bit of background? Because what was interesting, and it's probably a little bit similar to kind of my story in some cases, that where you got from basically, got to a point where you had no money, and then you kind of turned it around. So how did that kind of work in the first place? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, essentially what happened is I had a lot of points in my life where financially it was a bit of a roller coaster for me. And, I'd gone from boom to bust, boom to bust, boom to bust, so it was a fairly natural pattern for me. I knew that I had entrepreneurial skills. I knew that I had business skills. I knew that I could actually make something work. But I had, there's another story that not a lot of people know about. And that was that I had a business at one particular point, which was around the dot-com bust. Not the dot-com boom, but it was around the bust.
A lot of people around that, including myself. This whole generation have got smashed in that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, totally. And I had an idea one evening, and it sent me immediately to my office, my home office. And unfortunately, I got the idea around 10 o'clock at night, and I was there till about 4 o'clock in the morning. And the idea that I had was creating an online university. And I began to realize, I thought the biggest cost in a university is the human capital and essentially the real estate that they've got to use. And they're their biggest costs. But it just so happened that I was taking a gentleman who owned a college to the Grand Prix the following morning.
Nice.
And so I got this whole idea on a one-sheet piece of paper. And I called him and I said, before we go to the Grand Prix, how about we catch up at the Sheraton and have a coffee? And he said, yeah, sure, fine, let's do that. And I said, I've got this idea I want to show you. And so I presented this idea to him and he went weak at the knees. And he said, what are you doing this Friday? And I said, why do you ask? He said, come to Indonesia. and I said, okay, so what's the deal? He said, this is the missing piece. We have been looking for exactly this thing. And he said, this is so exciting. And so we built a business partnership in literally minutes. Wow. And we decided we were going to go into business together. I did go to Indonesia. The EBIT for the business, the projection for the EBIT for the business, he couldn't understand the figure. He kept looking at the spreadsheet and saying, there's something wrong with this spreadsheet. And I said, what is wrong with this spreadsheet? He said, it's the EBIT. He said, I don't think that's accurate. And I just kept working at the spreadsheet. I said, I've got the answer. The reason that the spreadsheet is inaccurate, it's based upon market share. So I will wind it back from 1% of market share, I'll wind it back to 0.07175 market share. And the EBIT came down significantly, down to about, I can't remember the exact figure, but it was like about $52 million or something like that. And so to cut a long story short, we go to Indonesia. We meet with the vice chancellor at a university there. We meet with a company that he's doing this deal with. And one of the guys stands up in the meeting. He says, I'm in. I want half of this business. And we said, half of the business? What are you bringing to the table? And he said, it's interesting that the audience that you're talking about, your market, you're talking about, I think it was 1.4 thousand people. So, not a lot of students in our first year. He said, you've obviously done your research because we have 140,000 students, distant education. And he said, now move your decimal point and see what your numbers are. And anyway, it really did our head in because it went from a multi-million-dollar business into close to $1 billion business. And that's on paper, of course. That's just on paper. But we opened it up, and in our first week of operation, we realized that our numbers were ridiculously conservative. But an interesting thing happened with that business was we had some Chinese investors that were interested in coming into the business. They told us so eloquently if the business went south that they wouldn't delete us from the planet Earth, that they would actually get rid of our surname. So anybody that had our surname would be gone. Now, I don't know whether it's an elaborate threat, but it scared the crap out of, at that point, we were 3 people in the business, as directors, and we were running it out of the college. And it scared the crap out of my business partners. And I learned a really valuable lesson then. I don't think it was specifically that turned the business over, but what it was low self-esteem. I don't believe we had the self-esteem to become billionaires in that moment. Let alone multimillionaires in that moment.
And prophecy, right? You're almost like putting up a barrier that you don't even really know.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that kind of leads me to another time in my life when things weren't going so well. I got down to my last $27. My wife, hesitantly told me that that's what we had left in the bank. And we were going broke big time, and we were seriously looking at homelessness. And I thought to myself at this point, this is it. I've had enough of this. What the hell is causing this? And there was only really one finger pointing in one area, and it was my mindset. And I realized that I was always robbing Peter to pay Paul. I was always going, in this cycle, and I wanted to work out that boom and bust cycle and how to get beyond it. So I started doing the inner work. I began to realize that a lot of my mentality, my mindset, my belief systems were really the things that were tripping me up. I would self-sabotage quite often. I would hear my inner talk, and I'd be at a meeting and putting a proposal down on the table. But my inner talk was going, you're a fraud, you're a fake, you're not good enough, you can't really do this. Come on.
Skinny and fat guy, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it was very much my mindset. But the thing that I discovered was what turned this around was I was studying life coaching at the time. I also had gone into the space of neuro-linguistic programming. Ever since I was 7 years old, I was reading psychology books. So the thing that I realized was it was definitely my mindset. So I got a coach. We started doing this work together. The fascinating thing that the results happened fairly quickly. All of a sudden, I had never, by this time, I'd had businesses, but I had never hit 6 figures. And it wasn't so important to get to 100,000 a year or 120. It was just that 6 figures. And there was such emphasis on that, through my working career, and I never hit that target. And then when I did this coaching, all of a sudden money started coming from everywhere.
Mm.
And I didn't even know that I had hit six figures until I was way into, well over 200,000 in that year. And then I got hit 300, then I hit 400, and I was earning a lot more money, and I was way on target to earning my first $1 million in a year. And I realized I also needed to do some inner work there, because a friend of mine said, John Howard was the prime minister at the time, and he said, you're earning a hell of a lot more than John Howard, our prime minister. You only work 3 days a week if you're lucky.
Don't get the pension he gets, but
Well, oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's about the only reason they do it, I think.
I think you're right. So it made me realize that my mindset had made such a big difference in my life. And I was in Hawaii at one point, and this lady tapped on my shoulder in a market, and she was a clairvoyant, and she said, "There's two things that you need to know." And I thought, wow, this is the best sales pitch ever. Or there are two things that I need to know. So I thought, what is it? A very small price to pay. It's a little gamble. Let's go for it. But she said two things that really almost brought tears to my eyes. The first one didn't. It overwhelmed me. She said, "You're going to write a book that's going to change the way the world thinks." All of a sudden I feel like Atlas. I'm carrying the world on my shoulders. But it was the second thing that really got to me. She said, "You think you're stupid." And she said, "You elaborate your language in order to prove to people that you're not stupid. The problem with this book that you're going to write is you're going to make it too big. You're going to make the language too convoluted, too long, too lavish, just to prove and overcome the fact that you're stupid. You must get some coaching on that." And what she didn't know was, when I was kind of 16, 17, when I had made these decisions that I was stupid, I used to write poetry. And one of the strategies that I had was opening a dictionary, looking for the most convoluted word, the most complex word I could find, and putting it into a piece of poetry, hoping that somewhere, sometime, someone would look at my poetry and go, "He wasn't really a moron." So yeah, so this really struck me. She hit me in the heart, and she kind of revealed something that quietly in my own thinking, I totally believed. And so when all these changes happened to my life, a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, he said, "Remember you told me that story about that lady in the market? You said you're going to write this book." He said, "What you've been sharing with me and helping me to do with my sales teams and all my people, this is the knowledge that should be in a book." And I went, yeah, maybe, because I couldn't shut up about it, because it was so exciting that my world had shifted so much financially that money was no longer a problem for me. I had new problems. I had tax problems.
Yeah.
And
problems, I guess, but still problems.
Yeah. And, and now I had to have financial people who said, "Look, you got to do this. You're going to pay 120,000 in tax, or you need to do this, you need to do that." And I began to realize that this was the thing that I wanted to share. I wanted to rescue every little Rik Schnabel that, was poor and impoverished and struggling. And I wanted to be their champion. I wanted to get out and say, it doesn't have to be that way. You really can change your thinking, and your thinking can start to create a knock-on effect. So that was a big, big turning point in my life.
The old saying is, what you think about is what you bring about. Yeah,
absolutely. It's a little bit like, what the believer believes, the prover proves. So we do, if we believe that something is going to happen, it's a green button, it's on. If we believe that it's never going to happen, we're never going to give it a go. We're never even going to try, or we will, and we'll self-sabotage.
Do you want simple and effective ways to get started that don't cost a fortune in time and money? Discover the best steps for each strategy we teach and the most important areas to focus on, and even to connect with your best customers and grow an online community. Grab your free copy of Startup Secrets for Entrepreneurs at startupsecrets.show. It's interesting when I play a lot of squash, and it's an interesting thing. Squash can be a very mind game. And most sports probably are, but squash in particular is almost like physical chess. And in some cases, you can win a match by thinking it out. You can actually convince the other player they can't win.
Yeah.
And they can be better than you, but you can still convince them that way. And I've had a lot of people over the time where I've played and I just couldn't beat them for whatever reason. I'm thinking, why can't I beat this person? And the first time I finally beat them, I never lose to them ever again.
Yeah.
And it was because the belief factor was that I couldn't beat this person, even though they weren't as good as me.
Yeah.
But I just couldn't do it. And as soon as you get over that hump and say, now I can do it, then they've got no chance then. Because, and then you just easily beat them. Like I played one guy that I used to struggle a lot with just recently. And it's like I beat him easily because I didn't even consider it being a problem.
Well, sport is such a mind game, particularly something like squash, because you're so close to each other. And, that very first serve can really mentally knock a person out. If you really get a power serve in there and they just can't return your serve, you do that most of us have what's called a 3-time convincer. So we just have to see evidence 3 times in a row or, 3 times and not the converse. And we'll just say, that's what it is. That's what we believe. And in truth, what we're actually doing is we're living a marginalized life, because the more wise we become, the more doors we close to what is possibility. I mean, so many people will tell you what is right.
Probably dictator syndrome.
Yeah, very much so.
About it, like it's almost like the dictators. They always surround themselves with people that are not game to say the wrong thing, and then suddenly, they've got this bubble, and they think that one's a certain way and it's not. It's funny with squash though. I used to play this guy that always we'd get to the last point, he'd nearly win and he'd serve the ball out and lose the game, and he did this like 3 times in a row. Yeah, and I think there's a bit of psychology in that one. It's almost like he didn't really want to win, right? It's almost like, or so scared that he's going to hit it out, he hit it out. It's almost like the old principle, like don't hit that light pole, and as soon as you do, you do.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a funny thing, isn't it? So many of us think that it's about, like squash, it's about skill. You've got to build your skill. You've got to build your knowledge of the game. But very rarely do we actually look at it's the psychology of the game. Very rarely do we say, how do we improve our psychology?
Interesting. I was playing the other day, and I was playing a girl, and what I realized was that I was actually subject to gender bias by default, and they wouldn't even realize they were doing it. So by basically favoring the female and giving them, chances or whatever in that scenario, and suddenly you're the bad guy, and you can see that entire psychology playing out. There's nothing I could do about it. No matter what I said or what I did, we couldn't do anything about it, because they didn't realize what they were even doing. They didn't even realize they were doing it, but I could tell they were doing it. Yeah. And it's like that scenario is like, it's the same thing as a lot of other things. Squash, if you're paying attention, you can see that what's going on around you, rather than most people just blissfully walk down and don't pay attention to anything that's going on around them, and that happens, and you get caught out then.
Absolutely. I had a similar situation where I used to love squash. I used to go very regularly, play as much as I could. And I remember playing a friend of mine's brother who was much younger than us. But the moment that he served that ball and I couldn't return it, it kind of befuddled me, because I was a little bit like you. Instead of gender, I was using ageism, as a bias.
Yeah, it's dangerous in squash because they start really young, and then suddenly before you know it, they're so much better than you because they got so much more time on their hands.
Totally, totally. And he psyched me out enormously, and I had to get over that psychology.
Yeah.
Because
that's a game everybody plays, and I think sport is the same principle. I guess there's a lot of parallels between sport and business. Yeah, I think the biggest problem with business is people don't realize that it's it is a marathon. It's not a race, right? It's not a short-term race. It's a marathon you've got to set yourself up for, and people try to do too much too fast. And actually, we had this conversation about social media, which is my goal this in 2023. My New Year's resolution is to see if I can quit social media completely. And so one of the things that I look at is that, and we talked about this before, about the amount of time people spend on social media, thinking they're getting a return on investment. Yeah. And I don't know whether they really are, because there's a lot of time that you waste in that situation. as well as the fact that, they've got new AIs and everything that can run all this content. So you're trying to win a content game as well. If you're like in your coaching business and stuff like that, trying to teach people stuff. So what's been your experience? And I think it sort of falls into that book that you wrote as well, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, when I looked at time, because really it's the only asset we actually really do have that's limited. It is a limited resource. 60 seconds is going to pass. Some people will maximize that. Some people will just waste it away. And many people waste their entire lives away because they don't make decisions or they don't ask themselves the right question. I was just working with a client just before we jumped on today who I identified that he procrastinates. He said, Rick, help me get out of this procrastination loop. And COVID has certainly done that with a lot of people. A lot of people are gaming, social media, doom scrolling and so forth. And
scary place.
Yeah. And that's an enormous waste of time. And about a year ago, I had this idea that I thought time was a very valuable asset. So I thought I would actually create an ebook about it. And I was just going to make it a short book, but I couldn't stop touching this book because I realized that time is such a valuable asset. And when you respect it, then what happens is you can really make it work in a big, big way. And I remember one of my mentors said to me, what is your key driver? What is the key thing that is bankable? When you do it, it's bankable. And I recognized that public speaking was a thing for me that was bankable. If I get up on a stage and I talk to an audience, I can move a lot of people all at once. It has a great leverageable effect.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I started writing about these key drivers, and there was a lady who I was coaching who had been aiming to, get out there and coach people for well over a year now. And she came to me because she said, I'm suffering. I'm not getting clients. So I'm obviously doing something very wrong. And I said to her, okay, so what are you doing? Just tell me what you're doing first so I can assess. And she said, well, I'm posting on social media. And I said, okay, so how often and how long do you spend on social media? And she said, 2 hours. And she was kind of waving her hands around, which kind of suggests it could be more. And I said, what, 2 hours, 5 days a week, 2 hours, 7 days a week? She said, no, 7 days a week. And I said, okay, well, let's look at that 2 hours. And, got out the trusty calculator and said, okay, so you're doing, let's call it 3 hours, and let's, by 365, and that's 1,095 hours. So that's a good investment of your time that you've been putting into this. So how many coaching clients do you regularly get? And there was silence, and the answer. And the answer is 0. And she said, I haven't had a client yet. And I said, that's a bit of a crazy strategy, wouldn't you agree? To just keep doing the same thing and getting the same result.
Maybe for 30 days, but no longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what she was doing is she was following what she thought a lot of people are doing that are coaches, that is very successful on social media. And she fell into the myth of success, and I think I was sharing with you earlier before we chatted about, the guy that stands in front of the Lamborghini and looks very successful, and she was doing, she was following that sort of model. And the female equivalent is looking very sexy, on a beach or out in the wilderness in your best outfits. And she was following those people. Now, I know, because I've coached some of those people, and I know the true story that actually sits back as to how well they do or how well they don't. And so it's kind of like a whole bunch of lemmings all following each other over the cliff. And that's what a lot of people do on social media. They just do the wrong thing. They waste so much valuable time.
And I think that's the trouble with social media too. It's a content game. And I mean, there's a new app that I was well, so much new, but it's been was a sort of chat CPG type. I forget the exact name of it. But basically, what it does is it automatically writes content. So, if you think you're going to win the content game, you can't, because there's plenty of people out there got, like in YouTube, they reckon the top 10 people in YouTube that make the most money have teams of 25 people doing this constant YouTube stuff, editing and cutting and all that sort of stuff. You can't compete with that.
Yeah.
So if you think you can win the content game, you won't. And so, but content feeds social media. The more content is, the better for them.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily benefiting you, I don't think. And all you're doing is really, as you say, distracting yourself from that time suck.
Absolutely.
Getting return on investment. And I think that I've always done with clients is I said, what are you worth per hour? What's your hourly rate? And how much money you want to work? And they say, I don't know. And I said, well, work out how much money you want to make in a year and divide it out for how many hours you're prepared to work. And it usually comes, if it's diesel, it'll come down to like $100, $200 an hour at least. And I said, if you're not earning that per hour, then what are you doing? All right. If you're just sitting there like posting away on social media, you're not getting a return on investment. There's two choices with that. One is pay someone else to do it, because they're a lot cheaper. You get someone for $5 an hour to do that. And then go and do something that's worth your time, or don't do anything. Like, I think at the end of the day, probably better not to do anything. You'd be less stressed, wouldn't you? Like, if you actually just got nothing achieved but for 2 hours and just basically thought about stuff for 2 hours.
Yeah, absolutely.
Probably more done, because I think one of the biggest challenges I think in business is that you don't spend enough time thinking. You spend a lot of time doing, but not a lot of time thinking. And sometimes you just got to take a day off and just think. And I find if you go and play, you go on a traveling way, like if I'm flying to LA or something, I've got 14 hours. And back in the day, you don't have internet. Well, I think they haven't really got that right, thank God, yet. But the thing is that, you've got nothing else but a book or an offline device. You've got time to think. And I think that's the biggest thing that a lot of businesses don't do, is they don't do enough thinking. They do too much doing and responding and reacting, but not thinking it out too well in terms of what you're trying to achieve. What's the laziest, quickest way there? I found out that your parents lie to you when they say you got to work harder. The harder you work, the better your money you make. It's the biggest lie ever. I think it was propagated by the Industrial Revolution, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's not true.
It probably was.
Yeah, and so I think that's the problem. People think that if they work hard, then they'll get a result, because the universe will owe them that, but it won't. Mostly. I mean, some hard workers out there get there, but I think, end of the day, it's not about working hard.
Well, I guess the thing is we follow so many myths, and there are many myths that are completely untrue. And you spoke about these YouTube geniuses that have massive followings, and I remember one particular gentleman that approached me, and he was doing quite well. Like, he was making about $200,000 a year off YouTube, and he said, I said, where do you want to go with this? And he said, I want to start making a lot more money. Mm-hmm. And so I said, okay, the thing that we've got to do in order to do that is, obviously, enough to be making $200,000 a year with YouTube. So now what we've got to do is work out what are the key drivers, what are the real things that give you the biggest bang for your buck. We've got to master those skills. And we've also got to now do some modeling, profiling on some of the big names that you want to get to. Mm. And it's kind of, we can all get busy doing so many things. And you're absolutely right when you say these people have to have teams behind them, because he had a very small team when we first started. Mm. And, his $200,000 a year, he's now earning $250,000 a month now. Mm. And he's doing very, very well. But, there's always that scalability. You've got to scale it up. Mm. You do have to have other people that you can rely upon, because I think too many of us rely upon ourselves only. Mm. And we find ourselves, doing very low quality tasks that don't create.
As you think you are either. Once you get under pressure, you're not as reliable as you think you are.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's been so many studies over the years. I remember Germany had created a particular law where they would not let people work more than 9 hours a day. Mm. And it was all based on the fact that, anyone...
Slow day for an entrepreneur, wouldn't it?
What's that, sorry?
That'd be a slow day for the average entrepreneur, wouldn't it?
It would be, yeah, it would be, because, a lot of us put some good hours into what we do. Mm. But, they found that people who work over 9 hours a day, actually their productivity almost halves. Mm-hmm. And it's because we are in the space, so we think we're doing, but we're just in the space. In fact, there was a gentleman who I was just coaching before we jumped on. His problem is, you were talking about thinking and doing. His problem is the other way around. He thinks too much.
Yeah.
He thinks far too much. And he said, I said to him, what's our goal? What's our goal and how can we measure it? And he said, the goal is productivity. I am just not productive. And I said, well, when you're not productive, what are you doing? And he said, I'm thinking. But we identified actually the reason that he has resorted to so much thinking was because he was punitively punished, by his mother when he was very young, and he thought himself out of his problems. So he's predominantly thinking. Sorry, what's that?
He's rinsing and repeating.
Yeah, exactly. He utilizes thinking to rescue himself or to get himself out of all problems. And so sometimes we can think far too much and do too little.
Overwhelm yourself, yeah.
And it's something that I certainly recognize because I had a very punitive mother as well. And the thing that happened with me is I would think things through to the degree of what you might call overwhelm or procrastination. And I realized I had to break that model. So I had to make decisions much, much faster. And I started very small by simply, every time I went to a restaurant, I would drive people crazy because I'd open up the menu, particularly if you go to a Chinese restaurant and you open up the menu, I wanted to look at everything twice at least. So everyone would be waiting for me to place my order. And so what I started with that, I thought, right, I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to be the fastest person on this table to make a decision. So I'd open up the menu, look, and I'd just choose something. I'd say, I'll have number 59, and that was my order. And it was uncomfortable. It was really disgustingly uncomfortable for me.
What the worst can happen, right? The worst that can happen there? You got a meal you probably would have chosen one anyway that way. So, unless you know exactly what you want, right? You're going
Exactly. But you're conditioning your mind. You're conditioning your mind to create the behaviors that you really want. And there's no such thing as practice makes perfect. That's rubbish. It's nonsense. Perfect practice makes perfect. So you work out what is the perfect practice and you just keep running over that myelin sheath in your brain until your neurons say, this is what's normal. And then you become that person that you ideally know is going to be highly productive or highly profitable.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is once you build that model of the way you run things, it's easy when you actually understand yourself and what you decide. I think that's probably part of the biggest problem is, and I think I always look at the principle is that what's the lowest level of activity can achieve a result, and if you can achieve the result you want, then anything extra is a bonus, right? You can labour up, but if you've got to work a lot hard on something and you realise that any drop off of activity is going to wreck your thing, and then you're probably sitting a rock for your own back. Like it's never going to sustain it. And I think that's what I see a lot of things on social media. You see this big starter post, they'll start posting every day or doing videos every day, and 30 odd days later they're all gone, never see them again because they couldn't sustain it. You couldn't keep that activity up.
That's right.
And that's because they're trying to run a race rather than a marathon. And I think that's common in most people. They get excited about something and dig into it, and then they realise that it's not going to work. I'll just do something else. I'll move on to something else.
Yeah, but there are some cases of some people who are just very well geared towards being incredibly determined and productive. My mentor was sharing a story about a gentleman that he had coached at one particular time, and he'd just been a monk. He had no money, and he said, I want to be very, very successful in the self-development space. And my mentor said, right, this is what I want you to do. I want you to create 1,000 videos on YouTube, 1,000. And he did it. He produced over 1,000, but he was working 18-hour days, 7 days a week in order to actually get there. But today,
he's not going to keep going like that, right? He's going to do that level of activity, and then he's going to stop it rather than continuing to try and keep it going and basically destroy yourself in the process, right?
Yeah, but what he ended up doing, I mean, he's now making around $2 million a month and he's doing very, very well. And he has now scaled it and got a team and other people who do that. But he did the hard work, and he definitely got it working for him, which was absolutely awesome. But you need to be able to know when it's time to scale and do the next thing.
Yeah, that's the hard part. So I was often asked a question, and what would you tell your younger self if you ran into them about something, what not to do or what to do in their life? Like, what would you give? What advice would you reckon you'd give?
Yeah, I would say to my younger self, learn NLP, learn how to master your mind much, much earlier, and make that your goal. Get your mind right first, then focus on your passion and where you want to direct your mind, but get your mind right first. The biggest struggle that I had in the very early days is I came from a very traumatic childhood, and I was traumatized. I didn't know it, but I was traumatized. And so I had a very low self-esteem, and, I didn't get this stuff right.
Life has to beat that out of you eventually, right? One way or the
other. Well, either that, or you're going to find yourself in probably a train wreck situation. Exactly. So I would say, your mindset is everything. It's gold, and when you get your mind right, anything can shift and change. The rest is systems, strategies, stuff. And you can find that information so easily, but the harder game is getting the mindset right to work in those strategies.
Yeah, because I remember, I think the upside of Google, I always say to people go to Google for free information, they go to Amazon to pay for it, right?
Yeah.
But when you think about it, like when our generation grew up, there's no such thing as the internet, right? The only way you found stuff out was out in books. And then when something like Lotus 123 came out, there was no help. So I had to sit there and press each button until I figured out which each sequence of buttons did, and wrote them down to actually work out how to use that thing.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time in there and actually did quite a lot of work in that area, in that spreadsheet work, because I could actually figure it out. And what I realized was it gave you a skill to be able to figure something out, even if you can't have a lot of resources. And then when you've got a lot of resources, it just makes it even better.
Yeah.
And I think the concept of that common sense, or that thinking, which I find is quite not very common, right? It's like people's critical thinking. It's like you asked a question, and we get it a lot with clients. So they ask a question, they go, "You could have Googled that." In fact, there's a thing that I sometimes occasionally give this people. It's like, Google it for me. It's like you can actually do it, and it actually does it for you. Actually takes to the screen and actually Googles the word whatever you want. It's like a passive aggressive way of probably losing a client. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like an interesting idea. And you say, if you just Google that rather than email me and wait a day or so for an answer, you could have saved a lot of time, but you switched your brain off.
Yeah.
And you didn't bother to think that it was worth that, just figuring, quickly finding the answer. You want to ask someone else the question. And sometimes, it's complicated and you don't want to know the answer, but often it's like Google will tell you the answer pretty quick. Maybe right, maybe wrong, but at least you've got somewhere to go.
Totally. But we've got shifting sands now. Like technology is still moving very, very quickly. And what we did at the beginning of the year is often not what we're doing at the end of the year. Yeah. And those who are not awake,
yes,
are not seeing what the opportunities are. And there was a guy, Gerald Zaltman is his name. He's a Harvard professor. And he said 95% of everything we do, all our emotions, feelings, actions, behaviors, are all unconscious. So the big opportunity is exactly what you're saying there, John. We've got to wake up. We've got to say, okay, we've got to wake up.
Why are you doing that? Why are you saying that? Why?
Exactly.
That's the big why, I think.
That's right. And it's a little bit like if I decide right now, not to brush my teeth, and I don't brush my teeth for the next month, my teeth are going to be in a really bad state, but my nose is just above my mouth, and I'll be the last to smell it.
Yeah, bizarrely, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's like you got two eyes, but you never see your nose.
Exactly. The only thing you will never, ever, ever see is yourself. You'll see reflections of yourself, pictures of yourself, but you nell see yourself.
Or hear yourself, for that matter. They reckon you don't even really hear your own voice.
That's right, because of the bones in your head and how all that works and your nerves.
Bizarre, isn't it?
But it's an illusion anyway.
But the one that gets me is you can't see your nose.
Yeah, that's right.
It's in front of your face, like you know, in normal circumstances, it's in the way,
Yeah,
but you don't see it. It's one of the mysteries of the way the universe sort of puts things together, right?
totally. You
Yeah.
know, and it's an irony. And the thing that we've got to be able to do is we've got to draw our interest back at ourselves.
Mm.
And very rarely we do that. It's very easy to judge somebody else,
I do.
and there are a million critics out there.
Yeah.
But I often say, people say, coaches, whenever I'm coaching coaches, they'll often say, I'm a bit reluctant to go out there. I go, well, that's the journey. You've actually, if you want attention,
Mm.
you've got to put yourself out there.
Mm.
And, of course, their biggest problem is, hey, but I'm going to be criticized. Well,
You know,
you've just
the
got to
really
accept.
bizarre thing about this, I think as you get older, you realise this. Nobody actually pays any attention anyway. They don't
Yeah,
care what you say. They don't care what you do. They're just glad that they didn't do it. Right? And so you're sitting there going, you're on stage thinking, oh, I'm scared of being on stage. Well, they're not actually, the audience is not worried about that. They're just grateful they don't have to be up there.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
totally.
why they don't want to be there. So it's kind of weird when you start thinking what people care or think about you and they actually don't think much at all.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it was actually my very, very, very first coaching session that I ever had. And my coach said, what do you want to work on first? And I said, well, the first thing I want to work on is I've got a book idea, but I'm really scared of putting it out there. And she asked me that
We
I've
get
learned.
that when I do book publishing, we get that commonly. People are scared of what other people are going to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And she she said, "Do you mind if I just come out with one statement that I think is going to help you enormously?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "You know, it's none of your right."
None of your business what other people think, right?
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly, and that's exactly what she said. But it was the first time that I'd ever heard that statement.
yeah.
But I could feel my mind shifting in that moment,
Mm,
and so as a result, I went out and I published that book, and that book has literally made me millions of dollars.
mm,
But
mm.
not one of my family members have ever read that book, and that was what I was really concerned about,
And
that
you
my
know what? They
family
don't.
would
Well,
read it.
they're not your best customer anyway. So what does it matter? I always reckon if someone is the person that matters, opinion matters the most, is the person with the credit card in their hand. That's the one that matters the most. The rest of everybody else has just got an opinion. Everybody's got one.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But that's the business model, isn't it?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you really want to be speaking to the people who care about what you care about most.
Mm, mm,
And when you can find that match, that is absolutely a marriage made in business heaven. When people really get you and they really get what you're about and they really want to get what you give, and that's when you get that perfect synergy.
So it's funny that I read. I don't know who said this, and I can't remember what it was, but it sort of had an impact on me. It said, "I'm done trying to convince people." And I thought about that, and that's good. That's a big sort of think when you think about that, because the reality is that trying to convince someone to do something,
Yeah,
particularly like part of the reason why I don't really like coaching that much, but the thing is that trying to convince someone to do something or buy something, whatever, is really hard work. If you actually come to you already and they're willing to do something and they're looking for it, then they're so much easier to have a conversation because you just help them, all right? And I'm thinking to myself, that's a lot. There's a lot of science in that. I'm done convincing people, because I think if you try and convince people, it actually look like you're actually trying to, I guess, trick them or whatever, because that's mostly what you're trying to do when you're trying to convince people. Then they're completely shut off, and if they're shut off, it's never gonna work anyway. you know.
well, I think that you can help people to help them to convince themselves, and I think that's what you're doing a lot of the time in coaching.
Mm,
Because what you're doing is they're coming to you and they're saying, this is where I want to go, but this is the reason that I'm not going there.
mm,
And what you've got to then do is you've got to then work out what is the neural pattern that persists with the resistance.
mm,
And you've got to work out how to kind of turn their thinking around. And I remember a particular client of mine, and she really classified the idea of thinking to me in this session. I won't go into the detail because it was pretty gruesome. It's pretty horrible, and it will take this whole talk on a bit of a down note.
We're about to come up there, not down there.
Yeah, but she was having a very horrid life. Her mother had done some things that, was very questionable at so many levels. But she said to me in this one coaching session, she said, I cannot understand why a mother would do that to her own daughter. Mm. And I stopped her and I said, at the very beginning of our coaching, you said to me, the biggest problem with your thinking right now is you feel like you're going insane. I said, I've worked it out. I've realized why you think you're going insane. What your mother did was insane. And you are trying to understand the mind. Yeah, exactly. You're trying to understand the mind of a mother who's insane. Mm. And so as a result of that, you are driving yourself insane. And all of a sudden, bing, that was the epiphany for her. And she progressed enormously from that point. But the thing that we've got to understand is the thinker, metacognition. We've really got to understand our own thinking, but not what we think, but why we think the way we do. Mm. And why we think the way we do has a lot more merit and gold than what we're actually thinking.
It's quite interesting. I read somewhere where it's called strings of steel, right? So you start off this little tiny thread of something, and you just keep layering on top of that till it's a steel beam.
Yes.
And that's basically what happens in a lot of people. They keep layering on top of that thing till it's so strong and so steel made that you cannot shift that thing and you can't move it away. And it could have come off a foundation of completely the wrong thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
You've layered on top of that thing until it's so deep there's no way out of it.
Well, the common thing that I've heard from my clients, of course, I'm always asking them for testimonials. And I remember one particular week, there were two gentlemen that gave me almost the identical testimonial. It was slightly different, but the beginning was the same. I wish I'd done this 40 years ago.
God.
That they were, they were trying to overcome a problem that they'd held for 40 years. Mm. I was working with a gentleman in Holland just recently, and his big problem, he's in business, he's starting a new business. It's a very exciting venture. And I said, what is the problem that's holding you back here in your business? And he said, I wouldn't tell this to anybody else, but he said, I don't think I'm smart enough. And so all of this, of course, went back to when he was a kid, and we undid all these programs. And he gave me another quote, I wish I'd done this 50 years ago. And quite often what we don't realize is that what we've got some program that is perpetuating the same frustrations that we've had for so many years.
Is it a theory that what you think about today, you thought in 90% what you think about today is what you thought about yesterday and the day before and the day before that. So you're not doing
absolutely.
It's all the same.
About 90% of our thoughts are the same. They're just on repeat. That's all they are. We think those same thoughts until they're interrupted or they're disrupted. But they're the same thoughts over and over and over again.
Yeah. Well, I wish we could go on for hours with this. We'd better slow.
We better.
Stop now. Otherwise, nobody'd be listening to me. So give me an idea of who you're looking for as a client, a reader, or anything, how they can get in touch with you. Like, what would you like to happen from this podcast so they like what they heard?
Yeah, I guess the people that I love working with are people who are passionate about where they want to go, but they're not getting there for whatever reason.
So they're stuck, basically.
Yeah. And, they're the ones for me that give me the biggest joy because, you get someone who's just been bang, 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 hitting up against something and just haven't been able to get through it. And now they're getting through it. So that, for me as a coach, is the biggest joy. So it's the untraining, the brain untraining part of it that I really like. I'm not your typical coach. I don't just ask questions like most coaches do. I like to go deep into the neurology and work out why is a person stuck.
Why they're saying that. Yep, makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. So I know you've got about 5 books or so on Amazon, so you know, obviously search the name on Amazon, and we'll put the links up on our system, as well as your website and stuff. So I really appreciate you coming along. It's like I said, we could probably go on for a long time. We'd have to have like 3-part series on this thing.
We could, John.
Yeah. But just of time. So really appreciate it, and hope to have you on again soon.
Thank you kindly. Thank you very much for the invitation too.
Cool. Thank you. That's a wrap on another awesome episode for the Startup Secrets Show for entrepreneurs. Just before you go, if you like this episode, we'd be very grateful for a 5-star review. Please also consider recommending the show to a friend or two. Make sure you subscribe for future episodes at startupsecrets.show right now. Until next time, if you're an entrepreneur, make a start on your next great business idea today.